oldest that were already starting to go bad. But the customers assumed, and perhaps correctly, that if they cooked the meat longer, it would probably be safe to eat. Sausages and ground meat were a major item in people's diets, particularly at breakfast. Breakfast was a time where you ate hamburger. And dinner time, or lunch, our lunch, was a time when you ate steaks and oysters. Oysters were, like steak, one of the major foods that Americans ate, and they were the prices were low, and so they were consumed by all classes. And San Francisco Bay, for example, was a major source of shellfish, which was consumed. Fish was not a major item of consumption. Yes? Well, all across the country, but they were produced here in large numbers.
Nowadays it's kind of considered like a luxury.
It wasn't then at all. It would be equivalent to 70% hamburger today. So in any event, lots of meat, lots of starch, lots of sugar. Oftentimes your fruit is cooked fruit with a lot of sugar in it, or canned or home-prepared fruit, which really requires tons of sugar if it's to avoid problems of botulism and so forth. It was typical for housewives to do a lot of canning, or not necessarily, I'm using the word can, but I actually mean put things in a bottle that's sealed. And you cook it for a long, long time, and you have to put a lot of sugar in it if you're going to avoid the dangers of botulism, which people did die from at a much higher rate than they do today. But sugar was important in order to avoid food poisoning. But it also suited the sweet tooth of most Americans. And so canned fruits were then used to make fruit pies, which were served hot typically, not cold. And fruit pies were a staple food for most families. The freshness of the food you bought at the store was not really a major concern. If it wasn't fresh anymore, it would probably be obvious. Just like when you're trying to cross Market Street, it would be obvious who was going to stop for you and who was going to keep on going. It was a society in which you could figure out a lot of basic things yourself, plus you knew the food producer, the food distributors, the food salesmen, the grocers, and the butchers. You knew who was likely to be honest and who was likely to be dishonest whenever he could. You had a sense of character. You might indeed go shopping at a store where you knew the owner was fundamentally dishonest, but if you knew that, then you knew what to look for as you're going through the goods. It's, again, a place where local knowledge and individual negotiation is always at play, and you can count on that because it's based on your own experience. And the slogan, "Let the buyer beware," makes perfect sense in a culture in which everything is based on immediate local knowledge. Yes, you should be able to beware. You should know when someone is who's going to trick you and how they're going to try to trick you. As the country becomes more and more industrialized and products start coming from far, far away, and grocery stores and so forth replace local general stores, it becomes harder to know what's going on. There's no longer, local knowledge no longer has the same value, though it's not completely irrelevant. And at the same time, you don't know what's happening further down the chain. Previously, even if food came from somewhere else, you relied on the local knowledge of your supplier, who was dealing with the distributor, who would also be dealing with somebody in another place, and that there would be a whole chain of personal communications going on. And the other thing is to make sure you cooked your food for a good long time. Now, concern about food safety developed almost accidentally during the presidency of Theodore Roosevelt, but he embraced this theme as, for him, one of the most important things he had done as president. In 1904, Upton Sinclair, who was a 26-year-old journalist from New York, started doing research for a book on the Chicago stockyards. He was living at the University of Chicago Settlement House, which was a male counterpart to Jane Addams' Hull House, and he was studying the living and working conditions of immigrants working in the meatpacking industry. Sinclair was a socialist, and he wanted to write a shocking expose of the exploitation of the poor working in the meat and food processing industries. So he published a novel, The Jungle, in 1906, and it became an overnight success. Has anybody here ever read The Jungle? Oh, lots of you. Okay. The story centers on a Lithuanian family who came to Chicago looking for a better life. Instead, America destroyed them. Sinclair's novel was based on a great deal of documentary material that he had collected about unfair working conditions, and that was his primary concern. And then secondarily, unfair housing conditions. But it was his description of the contaminated meat that the major food packers produced that fascinated the nation's reading public and turned it into the book into an overnight success. Was it true that workers who had accidents wound up in the sausage machine, and that the companies refused to stop the line in order to retrieve the body? That was a question that people were asking after they read the book, or more likely after they read about the book in the newspaper. If they had an equivalent of Oprah at that time, it's what would have been discussed continuously. It's one of the most shocking scenes in The Jungle. It's probably the most disturbing assertion of the book. Sinclair also described spoiled hams being treated with formaldehyde to preserve a fresh-looking surface appearance, so the price could remain higher. It could still be sold if it was rotting, but it would have to be sold at a cheaper price. So if you dip it in formaldehyde, you can still charge the fresh price. Well, you can cook out germs, but you can't cook out the formaldehyde. So people were essentially consumers of ham, canned ham, were being poisoned in a very serious way without necessarily knowing it. Were sausages made from rotten meats, rats, and adulterated with sawdust to puff up the weight? This was a third question that people were asking. The picture he painted said that the food Americans ate was contaminated and unhealthy, and they were eating plenty of bad food. Even President Theodore Roosevelt read The Jungle, and newspapers reported that he could no longer enjoy his breakfast sausage every morning, worrying about what poor immigrant might be ground up in it, or how much rat meat was in it. So Roosevelt, in order to gain greater confidence in the food that he was eating, but obviously had other ideas behind this, ordered a study of the meatpacking industry. And the authoritative study reported 3 months later that Sinclair had not exaggerated one thing. That all of these incidents that he had reported, while not happening every day, were in fact regular occurrences. Yes?
How did he have an order of study of it? Like, did he send people undercover or like?
No, it was a public study. He assumed a group. He assembled a group of experts, primarily from the universities. He included people members who were executives in the food industry, and he included members who were coming from the trades unions that were involved with the food industry. And it was all public, so all the food processing plants knew when somebody was coming. So they did these voluminous reports on what they saw, who they talked to. And their conclusion was, yes, there were Lithuanian immigrants, or perhaps Slovenian immigrants, or some other kind of immigrant in your breakfast patty. Roosevelt sent the report to Congress, and he demanded legislation to prevent such things from ever happening again. Now, one can imagine how the food processing business responded to this. Anyone want to hazard a guess?
They probably just paid order to oppose like everything that they said by a study done within their own way of doing it.
Well, yes and no. I mean, they did quibble, but actually what happened was that the biggest meat packers, Swift and Armour, in particular, joined forces to support the law. And their own reports, their own independent report, largely confirmed the findings, except that they identified the medium and small-sized packing houses, meat-producing plants, as the source of the problem, and the large corporate-owned plants were, not absolutely guiltless, were largely well run, and were largely free of this problem. So they actually actively lobbied for the law. This is one of the ways in which government grows because corporations, not business, but corporations needed it to grow or wanted it to grow. The large meat packers knew that it would be easier for them to comply with any of the regulations demanded, but that their smaller competitors, who they were trying to drive out of business in any event, would not be able to afford these reforms. Reform legislation would help further concentrate the food processing industry and eliminate, one might say, in the language of the time, the most inefficient producers, who are also the most locally based, perhaps, or regionally based. They also believed that government certification would help boost sales in Europe and